serving at Calvary United Pentecostal Church under Bishop Roger D. Lewis as assistant to the pastor. He was raised by his great-grandparents, the late Bishop Zachariah Moore Sr. and missionary Carrie Moore, who in 1955 pioneered 5 Trinitarian holiness churches in Mobile, Alabama, that nevertheless baptized in the name of Jesus. Under their ministry, he was filled with the Holy Ghost and baptized in Jesus' name at the age of 14. At 15, he answered the call to ministry, was licensed at age 16, ordained an elder at 19 within the Church of God Pentecostal Incorporated. Elder Nero holds a BS in Business Administration and an MBA in Management Strategy from Western Governors University, along with a certificate in Biblical Studies from Purpose Institute. He also teaches at Purpose Institute and remains active in oneness apologetics. He is the husband of one wife. Right. Amen. Kavisha, is that, am I saying it right?
I couldn't quite hear you.
How do you
Kavisha.
Kavisha, okay. One wife is Kavisha. And together, they are blessed with 2 sons, Braylon Alexander Zachariah Nero and Cortland Brooks Nero. We're so proud of him and thank you for your contribution. Please come and present. Let's give it up for brother.
Praise the Lord, everybody. When we first got married, my wife, she said, we talked about how many children we were going to have. She said, well, I'm one, so it's going to be 1 child. We had our second, and I said, well, I guess you went into false doctrine. So it's funny to see how that works. But nevertheless, good afternoon, distinguished scholars and colleagues. With sincere appreciation toward this assembly. I present a critical inquiry entitled Oneness Pentecostal Christology as interpreted through the matrix of personified wisdom. This study arises from an enduring challenge in constructive theology, reconciling oneness Pentecostal articulations of divine unity with the prevailing exegetical methodologies of mainstream biblical study. At the heart of this project is a thesis that might seem counterintuitive, namely that the linguistic and conceptual resources of Second Temple Jewish sapiential traditions offer an indispensable matrix for reassessing the Christological claims of oneness theology. Rather than simply contesting the syntactical constructs frequently marshaled to discredit oneness perspectives, particularly those found in Johannine and Pauline literature, my research proposes a hermeneutical transposition, an interpretive strategy rooted in the personification of divine wisdom as attested in the intertestamental literature. Section 1, the problem and purpose. The crux of the problem is neither merely linguistic nor exegetical, but methodological. Classical oneness theology, for all of its fidelity to biblical monotheism, has often been relegated to a defensive posture, lacking an internalized grammatical theological framework capable of reciprocal discourse with the dominant paradigms of the academy. This investigation therefore posits wisdom Christology as a means, a missing element that may serve as a theological lingua franca. Within Jewish and nascent Christian texts, Sophia or wisdom emerges paradigmatically as the vehicle of God's self-manifestation, an imminent extension of the divine agency, articulated without any implication of ontological duality or hypostatic division. When appropriated into a oneness Pentecostal hermeneutic, these sapiential motifs encoded in metaphors and personifications enable us to be able to commune with mainstream grammatical analysis while steadfastly refusing the imposition of metaphysical plurality upon the divine essence. The methodological apparatus for this project, or my studies rather, by design both are literary historical and grammatically comparative. First, I undertake a close reading of pivotal sapiential texts, including Proverbs 8, Sirach 24, and Wisdom of Solomon 7 through 9. I do this in order to discern the pattern of lexical and theological continuity between the testaments. Particular attention is paid to their development or the development of Greek prepositions such as dia with the genitive, alongside so-called attributions such as icon or prototokos and pleroma. Subsequently, these motifs are juxtaposed with Christological lexicon, or better yet, the lexicon of Christological existence in my phraseology of John 1, 1 Corinthians 8, Colossians 1, and Hebrews 1, with explicit consideration of both Trinitarian and oneness trajectories. The aim is to demonstrate that the New Testament authors, rather than introducing overtly ontological differentiation within the intra-nature of God, are recontextualizing Jewish sapiential paradigms in service of Christological confession. Arguably, the most entrenched resistance to oneness Christology in the academy is the accusation of grammatical special pleading. Trinitarian apologists and some exegetes, including gentlemen by the name of Gregory Boyd and Edward Dalcourt, contend that syntactical constructions such as the preverbal and aorist predicate nominative in John 1 or the genitive dia in Colossians 1:16 presuppose ontological distinction between the Father and the Son. Oneness apologists have traditionally responded with theological perseverance, but have often lacked the grammatical and conceptual apparatus for constructive dialogue. Yet, if these grammatical points of data are re-examined within the theological poetics of wisdom, their import shift, not to denote multiple divine centers of consciousness or existence, but to signify God's own revelatory subjectivity, his personal presence, articulated in and through wisdom. Wisdom within the Second Temple period context. The phenomenon of wisdom personification crystallized amidst Israel's exilic and post-exilic crisis, when temple, monarchy, and prophecy had been eclipsed. In this, Jewish religious imagination sought to articulate Yahweh's immanence without affecting or discrediting or not honoring his transcendence. Wisdom was narrativized as the very presence of God, as in the streets, at the gates, and importantly for us, at creation. As Elise Sennett and other scholars note, wisdom is never depicted as an autonomous deity, but as a poetic cipher for God's creative and sustaining agency within the world. Thus, sapiential literature paved a rhetorical path for affirming both divine otherness and proximity, a tradition the New Testament authors unmistakably inherit and transform. As we approach this from a theological standpoint, this literary theological matrix must shape our Christological reading. When Paul refers to Christ as both Logos and Sophia, wisdom, it is not to redefine monotheism, but to announce the unprecedented event, God's pre-existent wisdom becoming flesh, radicalizing the idioms of Jewish tradition within the incarnational drama. As noted by scholar Mark Edwards and James Dunn, pre-Christian Judaism already furnished robust conceptual tools for God's self-revelation that preserved monotheistic integrity, tools appropriated rather than overturned by the New Testament writers and witnesses. John's prologue then becomes a less of a metaphysical innovation than a sapiential recapitulation now interpreted in light of the Christ event. Let's examine these thoughts now within the context of prominent New Testament texts. As we look at the primary corpus from a sapiential standpoint, let us start with John 1 and verses 1 through 8. It now reconfigures the very language of Proverbs 8 and Wisdom of Solomon 7, embedding such phrases as in arche, that is used from the Septuagint, or dia atu, through him, or eskonos and ein humain, dwelt among us, directly from the Jewish tradition. Rendell Harris and others argue persuasively that John's Logos hymn is a Christianized wisdom hymn, an evolution in form, not ontological divergence. 1 Corinthians 8 and 6, a popular rephrasing of what many scholars believe, such as James Dunn, as a restatement of the Shema of Deuteronomy 6 and 4, finds an interesting state within this paradigm of thinking. We have the Shema, as we commonly know as oneness believers, merged and spoken through the paradigm of wisdom, most notably Wisdom of Solomon 9. For Paul, one God and one Lord denote modality rather than personality, a single sovereign subject disclosing himself through redemptive history using the language of wisdom. Let us go to Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20. It is laden with sapiential diction. He uses the very words of image, firstborn, fullness. All of these terms derive directly from Wisdom 7. The syntax of dia atu, which is an example of dia with the genitive, is not deployed to establish subordination or a distinct personal ontological existence into the nature of God, but is simply an already continuation of ways to express God's immanent action, literally, not through another, but himself within the world. This is the narrative of divine wisdom and narration. Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3 presents the Son as the apotheosis, the doxa, the radiance of his glory, the character, the hypostasis, exact represent or imprint of his nature. This, of course, is of no surprise that it is only a verbal echo of Wisdom 7:26. Here again, poetic imagery, not metaphysical plurality in its primary expression. For these examples, they express a comprehensive sapiential monotheism, presenting a Christological framework in which God's monotheism, presenting a Christological framework, as I said, is his monotheism through the embodied language of wisdom. So how can this be interpreted or integrated, and particularly in context of oneness Pentecostal apologetics? Situating oneness Christology within the sapiential matrix yields three salient advantages. First, it obviates the charge of unsophisticated exegesis that the oneness model is sometimes, they say, is vindicated because we evade grammatical norms. But through this, we can establish a historical chain of continuance from the Old Testament intertestamental period all the way to the time of the New Testament writers, which will enable us to conceptually appropriate translation of the syntax into its original Jewish registers. Second, this paradigm advances ecumenical reapproachment, facilitating dialogue, not only with Trinitarian scholars, but with the wider horizon of early Christian and late Jewish monotheism. Third, it provides renewed apologetic vigor, Logos, wisdom, and spirit, and even memra in the Aramaic, emerge not as disparate or different hypostasis, but simply as various modalities of divine immanence, one God and manifold self-disclosures. Implications for this from a future standpoint. The ramifications of this synthesis are multifold. Theologically, it engenders a conceptual grammar shared by both oneness and Trinitarian interlocutors, cultivating a discourse characterized by mutual intelligibility rather than conceptual isolation. Devotionally, it will reframe Pentecostal spirituality, anchoring the Christ event as the supreme manifestation of the one true God of the Old Testament, as articulated through the language of divine wisdom, a fact that cannot be denied from the most or the major tier of scholarship. In summation, to reimagine oneness Christology through the prism of wisdom is not to dilute its distinctiveness, but to amplify its exegetical credibility and dialogical potential by embedding the incarnation within the poetic and conceptual world of wisdom. We testify that Jesus Christ is the enfleshment of the Father's eternal wisdom, the living disclosure of the single divine identity, narrativized and made clear through the accessible work of him dwelling among us. As Paul says, as he attests in one of my favorite scriptures, in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Thank you.
Couple questions. You so are you in your research, did you come across like Jonathan Onkelos and the Midrash on Genesis about comparing the creation story with Proverbs 8 and the Ammon being there and the son of Yahweh being at creation, distinct from Yahweh? This is all part of the Jewish tradition. So if they're taking all of it, then we're getting a lot more than what is just going on the surface level.
The particular author, I may have come across him, but I can't reference him off the top of my head.
It's Aramaic translation.
Oh, you're talking about you said the Targums.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, you're talking about, is that Onkelos that says with wisdom and his son?
Yeah.
I believe that's relevant. I know there is some, depending on what version of the Targum you're looking at, there is some discrepancy on his son, really there or not, or how that should be understood. To be honest, I'm still making my conclusion on how to go about that Aramaic translation, but I am familiar with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the second question was you argued that it's an evolution of form, not ontological divergence. I don't see a difference between those two things.
Well, when I say form, like, and maybe I've just been arguing with Trinitarians too much. I don't think, and I think sometimes, and if this makes clear what I'm saying, is that I don't think that when we get to the New Testament, essentially, they're using unknown tools to express the way the divine operates within the world. I don't think it's a change in ontology or like, oh, this is big revelation. Surprise, there's really three of them. I think it's really just a continuation of language that would have already been familiar to them when they're formed. And I think it's sapiential. And I think, at least I have in my studies been missing it. If I'm being your question, you have good questions.
Thank you. That's all. Thanks.
I got another one.
Would you say it's more accurate to say that the incarnation can be embedded or is embedded by John in this Old Testament idea of wisdom? Or would you say it's more accurate to say that the Old Testament idea of wisdom is embedded by John in the incarnation?
That's a good way to put it. I would say John is, to me, obviously borrowing from this Old Testament and the intertestamental wealth of language to express the incarnation, because prologue, of course, I kind of think it was already a pre-existing hymn, and I think he's borrowing that language to express it. So I think John is just pretty much taking it and using it to emphasize a point of him. It probably in context to maybe some early forms of Gnosticism there, but I would say probably the former.
So like the incarnation being the reality and the wisdom language being a symbol used to explain or express the reality.
Especially looking at the major themes, and I think it is the premier theme of expression, and I think it's probably the premier theme of expression for many of the New Testament writers. 1 Corinthians 8 and 6, Colossians, mainly all the texts they used to try to say we're heretics. Most scholars, if you look at them, they all put them in a wisdom category. And one thing that I have noticed that none of them think that this is wisdom in its original context, talking about a distinct person, but essentially, yes, ADD got it wrong. It works really good in debates.
All right, let's give him a hand. This morning, we had two papers that were next to each other. I'm not sure if that was intentional by the people that set this up. And they were both on Romans, similar theme in Romans, so that was very special. And this afternoon, we have two papers on wisdom, and they likewise are next to each other. This next paper is by Tim Smith, and the title is God's Incarnate Wisdom, a Wisdom Christology. Timothy graduated from high school in 2018 after defending his senior thesis on, quote, the power of belief. This was a theological exploration of the new birth. This is in a Christian school that's not of his persuasion. He then went on to Urshan University, where he studied a plethora of topics and began to take special interest in Levitical law. Timothy graduated with a BA in Christian Ministries, Bible concentration. Continuing his education, Timothy pursued his master's degree at UGST and graduated with an MTS in May of 2025. Timothy's master's thesis was titled, quote, The Wisdom of the Torah, Exploring God's Wise Reading of the Torah in Galatians 3, verses 6 through 12. On a personal note, Tim Smith's a good friend of mine. I'm very thankful for his help. I was on sabbatical for a year working on a book on the Christology of John, and I have what I call an editing club. Anybody who wants chapters can get them, and they can send me their suggestions. There was no one more helpful to me personally than Tim Smith. He's a real scholar, and I appreciate his help in my life, and glad to have him here. Just while he's coming, I just want to say a special thank you to Elder Brendan Nero. That was incredible. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's give him a hand as he comes.
Go on, Morris.
You have the clip? Yeah. Right there. That's what I'm gonna do.
And then
Okay, good deal. Hello, it's my first time having to write my own bio, so I thought it was just strictly credentials, but since everyone else was doing the family, I'd also like to mention I have a beautiful wife since 2023 and a son who I wish he could be here, but he's entering his terrible two, so we had to get a babysitter. He likes to throw things these days. So I decided to kind of write something on wisdom Christology, and the reason why I did that is during my thesis, I dealt a lot with wisdom and how it relates to the Torah. And then I started realizing the connection, not only that wisdom has a Torah, but that it actually has with Christ, and how it affects a lot of the New Testament authors' view of Christ. So without further ado, what I'd like to do here is kind of read out a little bit of my introduction, give a PowerPoint slide, and then maybe read out my conclusion. With the advancement of studies in wisdom literature and its relationship to the incarnation, many scholars attempt to preserve Trinitarian doctrine, particularly the pre-existence of the Son. By relating the Logos in John 1 with Proverbs 8, some scholars articulate of wisdom from mere personification to a hypostasis, and the wisdom of Solomon and Ben Sira. This pilgrimage of wisdom has kept many Trinitarian scholars hopeful that wisdom Christology is compatible with the doctrine of the Son's preexistence. Nevertheless, one should not seek mere compatibility, but rather the overall probability. Is this the likely interpretation that the first audience would have understood when hearing John? Is this likely what John meant by these words? I don't think that's likely in the sense of this first century context, and thus the paper begins. What is more likely is that the wisdom of God in Jewish wisdom literature never hypostasized, but rather stayed personified until the person of Jesus Christ. Thus, the incarnation of God, Jesus, is the hypostatization, sorry, my dyslexia, but basically the personalization of wisdom. John argued this in the prologue, and Paul, likewise in Colossians 1:15 through 20. Thus, both Paul and John rely heavily on a wisdom Christology. I want to kind of put a note here real quick. It doesn't mean that's the only piece of background that we have, but that it is compatible with multiple other things that they may have thought about. Just like when you're writing something or when you're talking about theology, there's not just one sole background, but there's a plethora of backgrounds. So I'm trying to build a piece of Christology, a very major piece that has been missing in many circles. Continuing, that is God's own mind, logic/wisdom, was made flesh and fully personal in Christ Jesus. This will be argued by first exploring the theme of wisdom personified in Jewish literature. Next, examining John's usage of wisdom and of wisdom literature in the prologue of John. Then lastly, by obviously focusing on Paul's hymn, Christological hymn that is, in Colossians 1:15. And I focus more through 17 and 20, even though the whole hymn is through 20. And I hope that through this paper and thus this presentation, that conversations concerning a oneness articulation of the incarnation are enriched and that wisdom literature, both canonical and non-canonical, is more thoroughly examined. Now to the PowerPoint slide. So in order to really understand how Christ relates to wisdom, we have to take a little journey with wisdom and how she was utilized, personified wisdom it is, throughout Jewish literature. Now, when scholars go through this journey, and I put it more in detail in my paper, and then even in my paper, I realized, given the constraints of the pages we're allowed to write on, that going through a whole long series of wisdom's journey, I probably should cite down some sources who take about 50 pages or so on it. So I also do that and give you more depth on wisdom's journey. But overall, with all that collection of knowledge, scholars come down to mainly 4 conclusions. Of that cosmic order. It's merely just human. It's kind of a creation that it's just separate from God. Secondly, her own hypostasis. So this kind of gets into this Trinitarian ideology of that she's distinct from God. So, some would even kind of put her as separate from God and Jewish, because they believe in this Jewish development and El compared to Yahweh and all this stuff. But those consider the female aspect of Yahweh. So they would say that. Thirdly, the personification of God's attribute. And then, which seems pretty obvious in one in a circle. But lastly, and one that I think is worthy to explore, is the personification of God's self-expressed activity into creation. So now that we kind of get the 4 main explanations, it's probably good to go into the journey now. So in Proverbs, there are multiple places where wisdom is personified, but I've noticed 2 places in Proverbs that have particular argumentation on it, that people would argue some kind of distinct hypostasis possible. And that is in Proverbs 3:19 through 20, and the obvious one, the great and hotly debated Proverbs 8:22 through about 30:31. So as we continue and kind of, I obviously go in more detail in my paper, but kind of giving some quick power notes here. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 20 depicts all things being created by and in Lady Wisdom. I know one Trinitarian scholar who tried to put this distinction between wisdom, but it's a oneness with God, because trying to put that eternal sonship in there, that they really honed in on the preposition by, and that the author used the word by so specifically to show that she's not just a tool, but she was the one creating. However, it kind of gets undercutted when you realize that it's a little bit more ambiguous. Some translations say in wisdom. And it's not to say that by wouldn't be the right translations, but obviously with that kind of muddying the waters, the author's not meticulously choosing the word by to put some kind of theological argument down there. Next, we look at Proverbs 8, and a lot of scholars do agree that Proverbs 3, not all, but a lot, Proverbs 3 is a shortened version of Proverbs 8. Proverbs 8 will expand chapter 3. So in order to understand more on the comments of chapter 3 in those 2 verses, let's look at the whole section of Proverbs 8, starting with verse 22. It is as I said before, a very hotly debated passage concerning wisdom. Wisdom is created / begotten in the context of Proverbs. I know we typically hear begotten, not made, But that's actually anachronistic to the text of Proverbs. They're not dealing with an Arian versus Trinitarian controversy. They're dealing with a personification of wisdom. Now we got to understand what this wisdom is. So the original context would not suggest that, even if you use the word begotten, it's not begotten in the term of eternity. It is begotten in a sense of creation, of being a part of the created order. And for those of you who have studied some of the literature, I'm not agreeing or even leaning with Von Rad, but doesn't mean that nothing he says was wrong in that case. Got to kind of splice it out a little bit. But next, wisdom is not a distinct hypostasis here. What I realized, and this is kind of that fourth option, is that this is God's self-disclosure. This is God's self-expression. But how did God express himself? He expressed himself as the creative order. When God spoke into creation and spoke things to come about in Genesis chapter 1, that's wisdom. Wisdom, when God first spoke, the creative order came into creation. And that creative order is the tool, Proverbs 3, that is used to create the world. In Proverbs 8, personified wisdom is God's wisdom expressed into creation. Well, I kind of beat myself to the chase there, but there you have it. Moving on to Ben Sira. Now, this is starting to go into a non-canonical book, and there's a few things to look into Ben Sira. It's much like the book of Proverbs. Well, a few things to note, though. Chapter 1, God is the source of wisdom. Again, that thing proceeding out of the mouth of God, because the source is the divine mind, the divine intellect. That is God. Next, you got wisdom is created. Again, just like in Proverbs. It has the same concept of being created. Next, the hymn of Ben Sira 24 is similar to Proverbs chapter 8. And what you see here, though, there's a few minor changes. It's not really changes, but additions maybe is a better way to word it. And what you see here is wisdom comes from the mouth of God. See that in verse 3. And then wisdom pitches her tent in Israel. So the wisdom of God that was came forth from the mouth of God and was used as the tool of creation is now pitching her tent, was directed by God to pitch her tent in the Torah, in Israel. This isn't to separate Israel as a completely different being from God, but to realize that this is God self-disclosing himself through the creative order, in and as the creative order. Wisdom is revealed in the Torah. Get the point there. Moving on to wisdom of Solomon. I'm trying to rush through this because there's a lot of books to go through here, or at least a lot of chapters in each of these books to try to understand personified wisdom. But as we continue, wisdom of Solomon is considered the most Hellenized books of the wisdom books in non-canonical wisdom literature. And the reason why I put the parentheses there is what some consider the most Hellenized, what I realized when I'm reading scholarship and trying to understand it. I think his name's John Collins. He really gets into this, is that what it really is them in conversation with the Hellenists. It's not that they're adapting to Hellenist beliefs. They may be using Hellenist terminology, but really it's deeply steeped in Hebraic thought. So it's really not a Hellenized book, but just in conversation with the Hellenists. As we move in to the next section or further into Wisdom of Solomon to kind of tease this out a little bit, wisdom is never directly identified as God, but is closely related to him. And the point that I'm trying to make here with that is that in this book, because there is, again, it's God's self-disclosure into creation. It's something that we always have to keep in mind. There is a distinction between God and his creation. However, in order to best communicate himself and to reveal himself, he reveals himself by manifesting himself into creation. That is the distinction there. And the reason why because much like the first principles or the Logos and Greek philosophy, what happens here, and this is how you know this is not just a completely Hellenized book, but that it has Jewish thought, is that these first principles that people call, and you'll see this in John, they are actually not just with God, it is God. It's God manifested into creation. And how you see this is, once again, it's not a direct hypostasis, but God manifesting the creation. That's where I got to. But how you see this basically is once again in the language of Wisdom of Solomon. I'll point this out in my section on Colossians a lot. Wisdom proceeds out of the mouth of God. Wisdom has a lot of traits that God has. Even if they don't straight up say wisdom is God, what you see is the kind of the oneness in the traits in those. Trinitarians would say, oh, look, distinct hypostases, but same God. What I would say, no, the one true God manifested himself truly in and as creation. Moving on to kind of my conclusions on this section, wisdom as God's activity into creation. God is omnipresent. God intensifies his presence into / as creation. You kind of get this. I get this a lot from Terence Fretheim, and thanks for Rung for the suffering of God. He talks about this language of God not just simply localizing, but the omnipresent God intensifying his presence in a certain area to express himself and to relate to his creation. You have wisdom is the order by which God has created the world, but wisdom is God expressed into creation. Again, yes, it is the order that the Greeks talk about, but this order just isn't something that God used. The order is the very expression of God into creation. Ultimately, wisdom is God's wise interaction with and instruction to his creation. And I get this from Dustin Smith. He's a good Unitarian, although I say this Unitarian sounds very oneness half the time, but I'll let him keep his Unitarianness for now. But yes, that was a very good point that he uses in his book on wisdom, Christology, and John. All right, moving on. In order to understand the prologue of John, we need to kind of bring all this information together and now understand the relation between wisdom and logos here when John's using it. Logos was a Greek technical term for the creative order. Jesus used this term but rooted it in Hebraic category, much like the wisdom of Solomon. He's not conforming to the ideas of Greek thought, but he's using it kind of to saying like this logos that you're talking about, these first principles, it wasn't just with God, it was God. And that right there is really where we're kind of getting at the beginning of John. But logos was used within the wisdom tradition as well. And you see that, I think it was Ben Sira. But as we continue, I think one of the main things to understand when you're relating to Christ now is Jesus as the human. And what I mean by this is God has expressed himself into creation as creative order. God has expressed himself into creation as Torah to Israel, and they rejected him. And now God is expressing himself into the creative order as the man Christ Jesus. That is the beauty of the incarnation. This is a true, authentic man. This is a human. And what we have to look at is, yes, this is ultimately God manifesting himself. This is a sense of theophany, the greatest theophany. But what kind of theophany is this? We have to take the relations. How is he manifesting himself in the creation? He's manifesting himself in the creation as a true, authentic human man, a human person. And getting into the wisdom in John's prologue. So kind of can't see it from here, but the logos is used in John 1 to catch the attention of the Greeks, but was not meant to be understood within Greek categories. And what I kind of get into here, and Brother Norris in his book, The I Am, talks about the first century Jewish understanding of the incarnation. Since where his presence was, or where his name was, his presence was. And what that really means is that Jews didn't really think in these ontological categories like the Greeks did. It's not, oh, you have a divine hypostasis that assumed humanity and all this stuff. More so, it was about the divine activity of God and how he was manifesting himself in order to bring about his redemptive plan. And that's more of a Hebraic category, and that's what John's getting at here. And when we continue, Jesus, and this is a very important point, Jesus is actually not the Logos in verse 1, but is the Logos manifested in verse 14. Here we go, and I'll kind of bring out a more narrative approach to this in just a sec, but wisdom / logos is the tool that God created with the world with. See that in Proverbs 3:19, John 1:1-3. Wisdom / logos sought a home, but was rejected by the Jews throughout redemptive history. Sirach 24, John 1:9-11, because the world, and a lot of scholars do this, the world in John 1:9-11, they think it likely refers to the covenant community of the Jews before Jesus came, but that is up for debate. And then wisdom / logos finally dwells fully in and as the man Jesus Christ. So I just kind of want to bring this about. So what you have here, and I did this in my papers, I switched out logos with wisdom to kind of bring this about. And just as in Proverbs 8 and in Proverbs 3, wisdom was with God, but was God. The creative order was that was used, that came from the mouth of God to create the world. it wasn't just with God. It wasn't just some separate order, just some creation, but it was God himself manifesting his presence into creation. And this wisdom, this order, took its travels as divine wisdom, because this is the principle of life. This is eternal life, is in the very mouth of God. It is in the very words of God. This wisdom has been manifested through the written Torah, as it is with the Jews, but it was rejected by the Jews. They needed something different. They needed the Spirit. And the Spirit was ultimately released through where wisdom's final resting place is, and that is the mission of Jesus Christ. Wisdom was tabernacling as the Torah, but now tabernacles as the man Jesus Christ. This is the ultimate revelation and the beauty of the incarnation as seen in John chapter 1. Wisdom in Paul's hymn. Wisdom slash Jesus is the image of God. Wisdom slash Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. All things were created by wisdom slash Jesus. And wisdom slash Jesus is above all rulers and principality. All things are held together by wisdom slash Jesus. And just to kind of bring it out, and I don't know, am I at my 1 minute yet or 2 minutes?
Close.
All right. I want to read it off because sometimes when I just say this and then just put the verses up there, it's hard to really catch. But just as wisdom in Wisdom chapter 7, verse 26 said, indeed, she spans the world from end to end, mightily, and governs all things. Colossians says, or also in Proverbs 8:22, it also talks about, and this is where it's not directly saying the image of God, but it's saying how she was the firstborn per se. It was saying how she was the first of all creation. So it's kind of language, but just like she does this, he is also the image of the invisible God. In Proverbs 8:22, and here's the firstborn, the Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. And in Colossians 1:15b, the firstborn of all creation. Just like in Proverbs 3:19, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. It says so of Jesus in Colossians 1:16. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, all things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. Just like in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 1. Indeed, she spans the world from end to end, mightily that governs all things. Verse 17 of Colossians 1. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus is the very wisdom of God, God's self-disclosement or self-manifestation into creation for the purpose of our redemption. And that's why I would hold to wisdom Christology as a primary background for wisdom. And when we just look at it, it just seems to best fit a lot of the pieces that seem to be missing. And I think what's important is when we're talking to Trinitarians, and I'm also trying to come to this from a perspective of what they thought back then, not just a oneness advocate. They didn't have the same language that we had with them. They weren't having an Arian controversy. They weren't having to deal with how many persons are in the Godhead. They were simply realizing that God's activity divinely was working in and as the man Jesus. That Jesus wasn't just a prophet that God was working through, but that this is the very manifestation of God's presence fully for the purpose of our salvation. So to wrap it up in conclusion, it says, wisdom is God's manifested in the creation. To Paul and John, Jesus is the wisdom of God and wisdom embodied of God's person, presence, and character incarnate. And I think we just must always avoid certain anachronistic understandings of what's going on. I know I just said it, but to me, that's what really kind of brought me home to this. And I'll end right here. When I try to understand the text, it's not just me looking up the sentence and going, what would I think this obviously means? Because connotation-wise, words do change, meanings do change. It's in the background of Paul and John. How would they understand the text? And I think they understood it through a wisdom lens. Thank you.
There may be some questions.
Yeah, I was going to put this right. Oh, I guess there might be that person. Turn it back on.
I know.
Go for it.
Why is wisdom referred to the feminine as a woman? Let me qualify by saying, I'm asking you because my wife is not here.
That's a good question. Thank you. From my research and my understanding, it's a rhetorical purpose to bring wisdom. It's not necessarily that she's male or female in this context, but more so it's comparing to Lady Folly. And that's why John, I can see John using Logos and very easily switching the rhetorical purpose for he, because it's leading up to the man Jesus Christ as the incarnation of wisdom. And yet that flip doesn't affect the wisdom Christology because she's not ontologically a woman. This is a rhetorical thing to bring about the power, presence, and activity of God into creation. This is why when we're looking at Hebraic categories, it's less about ontological categories and more about the presence of God active into creation.
So there's a simpler answer to that.
Oh, yeah.
It's because the word wisdom in Hebrew
And Greek.
is feminine.
Oh,
And so you use feminine pronouns to refer to it. Just like if the word is neuter, you might call it it.
Yes.
It's like in English, we often refer to a ship as a she, just by convention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
On the scholarly doctrine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in front of Brockman or
No,
Brother McCall, whoever had a question there.
I was so impressed by your response, Brother Lee, that I had forgotten my question.
I have a question.
yeah, go for it.
So I need you to explain a little better. Jesus is the wisdom of God.
Incarnate. Yeah.
Okay, so you've said that now. So you need to explain that Jesus is not the Logos in John 1 and 1.
Well, he is the Logos.
But your slide said Jesus is not the
Verse
Logos.
14.
Oh, and John 1:1.
That's what I said. In John.
Oh, I thought you just meant John 1 in general. Yes. So what I mean by that is that Jesus particularly is the incarnation. So the Logos, there isn't an eternal Jesus in that sense, because Jesus is particularly God being manifested as a human person. So in John 1, the Logos can be like the word or like wisdom in the context. And it wasn't until verse 14 when the Logos became in flesh that actually leads to the man Jesus Christ. Does that make sense?
It just goes into the question. So in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
And the Word was with God.
Yeah.
God, they're the Father.
Yeah.
So Jesus is not God the Father?
So again, it would be a categorical error because, oh, keep going.
I was just, I think, are you making a distinction between Jesus referring specifically to the incarnation?
Yes.
As opposed to the way the name Jesus is used to refer to God generally in the New Testament?
The name Jesus does refer to God in terms of his incarnation, if that makes sense. So,
Exclusively in terms of his incarnation.
yes, God is still incarnate up in heaven right now. You see this in 1 Corinthians 15. So what you see here is with the Logos, this is God manifesting himself into creation. Oh, keep going. Okay, it's God manifesting himself into creation. And everything was leading up to the incarnation because that's the ultimate, the mission of Jesus Christ is the goal and is the purpose, the plan of our salvation. So you don't see mention of a man Jesus or Jesus Christ until the incarnation, because the incarnation itself is Yahweh saves. You can't be saved but through the incarnation. So therefore, if there is no incarnation, there is no Yahweh saves.
So I would assume you would say then, I don't know what the words in your mouth, so tell me if this is true or false. Would you be willing to say then that Jesus is participatory in creation, But only insofar as the wisdom is participatory in creation and the wisdom is in Jesus.
Yes, it's God's self-expression, but we always have to take into account how God expressed himself. If he expressed it, not a prophet, not like you and I being used through, that wisdom is used. The very embodiment of wisdom is the sense that God said, I'm going to manifest myself in my creation as an authentic human man. And we have to take in this step. And this is for the purpose of our salvation. This has nothing to do with God's ontology. This is God at extra manifesting himself.
So maybe to help us on this just a little bit, could you separate it out and say the Christ is not in John 1:1?
You mean like the anointed?
As a verb, like Jesus the Christ is not in. Jesus says, "I'm coming in my Father's name."
Yeah.
Okay, so whatever, however you want to do with that, but like to separate that from the manifestation.
Okay, so I guess, let me see if I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you asking that I can separate Jesus from the manifestation, or if I'm using, because I relate Jesus only to the manifestation of the incarnation, that I'm separating Jesus from God? Which one are you asking?
Because both will be reference.
Yeah.
You get different reference for them.
I'm trying to understand the Jesus is not in 1:1 statement. And so I'm just trying to
Yeah.
say
So-
Jesus Christ
Yeah.
is not in 1:1.
So see if I'm understanding it correct. You're saying Jesus is the name of a baby born in Bethlehem.
Yes, true man.
Okay, and so whatever he was ontologically, he did not exist before then. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So you're making a statement against pre-existence, essentially.
Yeah, there is no pre-existent son. I mean, in the logical conclusion, that means, because Jesus is only predicated towards the incarnation of God.
Yeah.
It's not to separate Jesus from God in the sense of completely, two divine hypostases are, it's more so what it's saying is that if Jesus really means Yahweh saved, then the whole point of the incarnation
So
is
when he
God.
says Jesus means Yahweh saves, he means literally, the word Yeshua means Yahweh saves, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
No.
So in your studies, would you say that considering wisdom, everything would be an ad extra reality, and that would manifest in John 1:1?
Mhm.
In the ad extra, God's outward expression, it is strictly about the ages and the epochs of time which God's wisdom has been manifest, the order of that which is and was and will be.
So, I think one thing that, of course, granted the limitations, how much you can present at one time.
Of course.
Assume that you don't have perspective on this. But I think one thing that's missing is that logos in the Septuagint is used to translate the bar
right,
word
right,
in the Hebrew.
right.
And that is the more common way of
Yes.
translating that, while the
Mhm.
Hebrew word for wisdom is not translated as logos.
Of course.
And there's reasons.
Yes.
for that. Of course, that only someone perhaps like Philo would
Yeah.
do
Yes.
something like word and, what is it, wisdom and logos perhaps.
Right. Right.
But granted, we're not talking about Philo's,
Right. No Philo.
crazy logos.
Yes.
But where do you see word? And, I feel like that's part of the bridge that you're creating between wisdom and.
Yes. So it's not that wisdom should be, that's why I started with, I'm not saying wisdom is the only background to understand this Christology from. Wisdom actually helps understanding with the bar or word. Because just as the word of God proceeds out of the mouth of God, wisdom proceeds out of the mouth of God. Is two separate things proceeding out of the mouth of God, or are they one and the same? Are they conceptually the same? God is manifesting himself into the world as the creative order. That is the voice, the very words of his mouth they speaking. That is creative order.
Yeah, and I think that ties in well in 119, which has all of these 8 synonyms for
Yes.
Torah, law, way.
Yeah.
That they're
Well, it's supposed to be recording stuff, but I don't know.
It's, well, two part.
Yeah.
Like, and I know we read some of the same authors, is what's the correlation between, like, people, the apologists who try to make wisdom like real personal existence, and there being a lack of a true worship, Yahweh code for wisdom?
Yes.
Why don't we find that if their assumption is true, part one?
Yes. Pulling from Dunn's work, it's a great way to actually defend against those who try to make wisdom more than what it is, and that is really just an extension of Yahweh. It's not a distinguishable person. This is why I say, like, in one sense, it's very good. It's a very good start to understand wisdom as a personification of God's attribute, but that doesn't go further enough. What really a person goes too far, and anything separate from God goes too far, and anything, Trinitarians try to do that, but they use Greek categories to do that. So from a Hebraic understanding, what we realize is that it's simply, again, and I may be saying this over and over again, the one true God manifesting his presence, power, his purpose into creation. And for the Jews, that is God.
But just 2 minutes, however that spells
For
itself.
sure.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And we never talked about this before. Is it true John Ronnie makes the claim that wisdom and logos are interchangeable in the first century?
I'm not so sure if he made that claim, because I know you focus more on this book, but I do know, granted, the whole thing with the Targums, he understands the Targums, that term there, Memra and Logos are very similar, but if we made them synonymous and that Logos is in the same term as Memra and the Targums, Trinitarians, that it just can't be, because then it would basically detract away from Trinitarian ideology.
They are interchangeable with Torah.
Yeah.
Torah is bigger than both those,
Mm.
which is another story.
Good. Very good.
You want me to take that?
You may.
I want to thank both presenters. They have
and Brother Cade Wilson, extensive discussion of the angel of Yahweh and the